Welcome. I'm Michael Langemeier, Professor and Director of the Purdue Center for Commercial Agriculture. In this brief episode, I will discuss the adoption of cover crops. Before we get started, as always, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. For most farms, conservation efforts are important, but they're only one of several farm goals. This presentation uses a multi-goal framework to address these trade-offs, which in addition to conservation may include risk reduction, profitability, farm transfer to a younger generation, and reduction in debt. And we're specifically going to look at trade-offs between net returns and soil health when adopting cover crops. When you're looking at the trade-offs between farm goals, it's important again to note that we don't necessarily have a single goal, and so we're not just looking at profit maximization or soil conservation. Why is this important? Well, a lot of times when you're looking at conservation, it may cost you something. You're getting some positive soil health benefits associated with a conservation effort, but there's no free lunch. It's going to cost you something to do that, and so you have this trade-off. Is my reduction in profit too much given the improvements in soil health? That's really going to depend on your hierarchy of goals. What goals are the most important to you? For example, if conservation is a very important goal to you, you're probably willing to spend more for a conservation effort than if profit maximization is your primary farm goal. In a recent survey, we asked producers to identify their most important farm goal. Choices included maintain stable income, mitigate risk would be what we're talking about there, conservation, profit maximization, passing the farm on to the next generation, and reduce debt over time. Before I talk about the specific results from the survey, you'll note that these goals conflict with one another. For example, a lot of times if you want higher profit, you have to accept more risk. If you want to improve soil health, a lot of times it's going to lower your profit. If you want to pass the farm on to the next generation, sometimes you have to give up something in terms of short-run profit to do that. Also, if you want to pass the farm on to the next generation, it may not be possible for the older generation to reduce debt over time. They may be more in expansion mode rather than trying to reduce debt over time. And so we have conflicts or trade-offs between farm goals. If we look at the results from the recent survey, what we found, and we've done this more than once, but I'm just showing the results here from February 2025. It was a farm goal survey that specifically looked at farm goals. Farm transfer was the most important farm goal to 34% of the survey respondents. Profit and reduction in debt were the most important goal for approximately 20% of the respondents, stable income 15%, and conservation 10%. After noting that there's the differences in the most important goal, with conservation being on the low end here compared to these other ones, I'm not going to talk about it today, but we also asked people whether all these goals were important. And about 20% of the 400 people we surveyed said every one of these goals was important to them. And so, yes, we have a most important goal, but a lot of times we have multiple goals that are very important to our farm. Therefore, we have to look at trade-offs between our goals. We also asked a question, do you plan to bring another family member into the business in the next 5 years? Approximately 40% said yes, and so that's very consistent with farm transfer being the most important goal for about a third of the respondents in the survey. So let's dig in a little bit more into trade-offs between farm goals. I'm suggesting that one of the things we can use to look at trade-offs is scenario analysis. This is used a lot by businesses. It's a planning and risk management technique that can be used to evaluate the potential impact of key management decisions. And so we don't just look at one possible outcome, we look at different possible outcomes or scenarios. And that's what I'm going to be doing with respect to the adoption of cover crops. Scenario analysis does not provide an optimal solution when farm goals are multidimensional. There is no the answer. This particular practice that I'm trying to adopt is going to satisfy all my goals. That seldom happens. You've got these conflict and trade-offs between farm goals, and so we have to look at scenarios. Does scenario A look better than scenario B? Today I'm going to look at, do we prefer current practices compared to planned practices, where the planned practices includes adoption of cover crop. And so scenario analysis provides us a mechanism to explore how a change in the operation impacts multiple farm goals. Scenario analysis is a planning and risk management tool, but can be thought of as a choice experiment in which we compare current practices and planned practices, and that's what I'm going to be doing in my example. A firm that ranks conservation as their most important goal, which there was some in that recent survey, would be willing to sacrifice more net return than a firm that ranks profit maximization as their most important goal. Also, if you're thinking about reducing debt, you're probably less likely to adopt a conservation practice because conservation practices usually incur debt, incur investments. So let's look at our cover crop scenarios. We're going to look at differences in net returns and soil health. There's a lot more detail in the associated paper that goes along with this. So feel free to take a look at the additional detail here. We're just going to hit the high points. But in each case, we're going to be comparing current practices, which is no cover crop, to a planned practice, which includes cover crop adoption. The difference between the cases is really the difference between what we expect to happen when we adopt cover crops. If we don't expect to have any cost savings from fertilizer, herbicide, direct inputs associated with cover crops, and we expect the differences in yields between crops with and without cover crops to stay the same over time, that's case number one. I would like to point out right away here, if you look at the precision conservation management analysis at Illinois, there is a yield gap or a yield penalty, if you will, associated with adopting cover crops before corn and before soybeans. So that's what I mean by closure of yield gaps. Case number two, we're going to look at cost savings of $20 per acre. I thought that would be kind of a fairly small cost savings. Cost savings can be bigger than that. But I thought just to throw that out there, if we do have some cost savings, would that change our decision? So every time I want you to think about, given the change in net returns and the soil health benefits, would I adopt cover crops? So that's what we'll be doing with all three cases. Case number three is a situation where we have a closure of the yield gaps. The yield gaps that we see for corn and soybeans after a cover crop disappear over a 10-year period. And there is some research literature out there that suggests that this is exactly what happens is we have some yield penalty or yield gaps in the initial years, and over time, there's no yield differences with or without a cover crop before corn and soybeans. All of these could happen, but I want to use all of these as examples or scenarios. And so let's look at the first one. We have planned practices here, plant a cover crop, single species cover crop. We're still going to have a reduced till, corn soybean rotation, and do not use manure. If any of those things change, we would change net returns and change the soil health. And so we're only changing one item here, planting a single species cover crop. The net return change using FinBin data and precision conservation management information from Illinois is a pretty large drop in net return per acre. It costs money to plant the cover crop, both in terms of the planting and the tillage that you might have to do associated with the cover crop, but also the seed. And so you add those things together, and there's definitely a drop in profitability. The costs are bigger than the returns. And there's also a drop in yield. So that's why we're seeing a negative $36 per acre. This would be very typical if you look at some of the literature. I have in green here the soil health benefits. I've got specifics in the associated paper, but there's a reduction in soil loss, reduction in greenhouse gases, and improvement in overall health score. And so positive soil health, negative impact on profitability. And I want you just to pause here. Is that too big a hit on profitability for us to pursue cover crops? For a lot of producers, it is. If you look at adoption of cover crops using census data, the adoption of cover crops is a fairly small percent, and it's because the returns are hit pretty hard when the first time we plant cover crops before corn or soybeans. So let's look at another scenario where there's some cost savings associated with a cover crop. Would this change how we think about the cover crops if we had some cost savings associated with cover crop? This could be in the form of less fertilizer or less herbicide, better control of weeds. This is single species, so you're probably not going to get a big boost from fertilizer, but we're just assuming there's some kind of cost savings here per acre. We're just using $20. And so again, the only planned practices that's different from the current practice is planting a single species cover crop. This time the net return change is negative $16. We still get the same soil health benefits. So if we wouldn't plant cover crops under case one, if the net return change is negative $16, is that enough drop in net return for us to adopt cover crops? And so that's what I'm trying to do here is look at trade-offs between goals, and every producer would have to look at this themselves because everybody has different hierarchy of goals and different priority when it comes to goals. And so this is kind of a what if. Would this be enough drop or enough improvement in net return compared to case one to go ahead and plant the cover crop? Case three is the best scenario we're going to look at today. And this, again, is the only plant practice is a single species cover crop. In this case, we assume that there's going to be a closure of the yield gap. Now, when we did the goals survey, one of the questions we asked is, do you tend to focus on short-term or long-term planning? 2/3 of the people said they focus on long-term planning. And so if they focus on long-term planning, this might be the case that is the most relevant to them. Of course, this might look different if you're on your own land compared to rented land. If the yield gap closes in 10 years and you don't expect to be farming this tract for 10 years from now, that's going to be a different decision whether this is some ground that you own and you expect to have that ground for a long time. So there's a lot of different scenarios you can look at, but let's say this is a scenario where you're on own land, and we're going to assume here that this difference in yield penalty or yield gaps is going to go away in 10 years. What would that look like from a profitability standpoint? Well, in that case, the net return change is really small. It's negative $6 per acre. We still get the same soil health benefits. And so in this case, there'd probably be a lot more people that would consider the adoption of cover crops. And so because we can't satisfy all these goals at once, we can't have all these soil health benefits at no cost, you have the trade-off. How much profitability are we willing to give up in order to incur the benefits? Well, part of that depends on the assumptions you make with regarding to the conservation practice. And so that's what we've done here with case 1, 2, and 3. We laid out a conceptual framework that can use to examine trade-offs between farm goals. Like I said, I have more examples in the associated paper. We've introduced this notion of scenario analysis to examine the feasibility of cover crop adoption. And finally, whether cover crops are adopted depends on the relative importance of profit maximization and conservation goals to the individual producer. And it really does depend on whether it's rented, owned land, and whether we have a farm or an operator that primarily focuses on long-term planning rather than short-term planning. So there's a lot of factors impacting here. That's why we have to look at these scenarios individually. We can't just make blanket recommendations because it is going to vary among producers. With that, I hope you check out the written material related, and I've also posted the slides associated with this. Thank you for listening.